a highly decorated black airline captain, fresh off a flawless emergency landing that saved hundreds of lives, arrives at the airport for what should be just another routine flight. But when he steps into the terminal, everything changes. A flight attendant, young, entitled, and full of unchecked bias, takes one look at him in uniform and refuses to believe he belongs in the cockpit. She scrutinizes his ID, humiliates him in front of passengers and crew, and holds up the entire flight. But just 5 minutes later, her world is turned upside down in a way she never saw coming. What happened next shook an entire airline to its core and forced a powerful CEO to confront a truth he had ignored for far too long. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from today. And if this story moves you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more. Captain Marcus Washington had long since learned the art of moving through the world with quiet authority. It was not something he had the luxury of taking for granted. The way he carried himself, the measured steps, the crispness of his uniform, the steady gaze that met people's eyes without challenge but with undeniable confidence, these were all tools, as essential as the controls of the aircraft he had mastered over 15 years in the sky. Yet, on this particular morning at LaGuardia Airport, none of it would be enough. The airport hummed with the familiar rhythm of pre-flight anticipation, boarding announcements echoing over the speakers, the steady shuffle of rolling suitcases, the weary patience of travelers surrendering themselves to the great machine of commercial aviation. Marcus moved through it effortlessly, his pilot's case trailing behind him, his ID tucked securely in his breast pocket, his mind already shifting into the focused state that came naturally before every flight. This was his domain, his world. But that illusion would be shattered before he even stepped onto the aircraft. At Gate B-17, his first officer, James Chun, was already waiting. James, younger but skilled, had spent the last 6 months flying with Marcus, and in that time, they had built an easy, unspoken trust. "Morning, Captain," James greeted, his handshake firm, his eyes warm with camaraderie. "Morning," Marcus replied, then grinned. "How's Emily's science project coming along?" "She won first place," James beamed. "She says she wants to be an aerospace engineer now." "Smart girl. Clearly takes after her mother," Marcus joked, and they both laughed. The conversation was light, natural. Two men who had spent enough time together in the cockpit to know that trust was not spoken, it was demonstrated in the moments when it mattered. As they approached the jet bridge, Marcus caught sight of the flight crew preparing to board. Most of them were familiar faces, but one stood out, Amber Whitfield. She was new, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made it clear she wasn't used to being questioned. The way she stood, the way her posture was just a little too stiff, suggested someone who had spent her life expecting doors to open before she even knocked. Marcus nodded in greeting, offering the professional courtesy he had extended thousands of times before. "Good morning." Amber's smile was automatic at first, the kind that flight attendants were trained to wear. But the moment her eyes landed on him, something shifted. It was subtle, a pause, a flicker of hesitation, a narrowing of the eyes as though she were trying to reconcile the uniform with the man wearing it. Then her expression cooled. "ID, please." It was a routine request, but there was something in her tone, flat, clipped, a little too formal. Marcus had been through this before. He didn't let it show. He simply reached into his pocket, retrieved his ID, and handed it to her. Amber took it, studying it longer than necessary, tilting it toward the overhead lights, flipping it over as if expecting to find some flaw that would confirm whatever doubt had settled in her mind. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, his voice calm. Amber's fingers tightened around the card. "This doesn't look right," she said, just loud enough that nearby crew members glanced up. "I'll need to verify this. Wait here." James shifted beside Marcus, discomfort flickering across his face. "That's strange," he murmured. "We just showed our IDs at security." Marcus said nothing at first. He had spent a lifetime learning when to push and when to let things play out. This was a moment he recognized too well, the kind that required careful navigation. The wrong response, the wrong shift in tone, and suddenly he was difficult, unprofessional, the kind of person who, in the minds of some, didn't belong in the cockpit at all. "It's fine," he said to James, though they both knew it wasn't. Amber disappeared down the jet bridge, returning moments later with Denise Rodriguez, the lead flight attendant. Denise, a seasoned professional, had been flying long enough to know who Marcus was before even looking at the ID in Amber's hand. "Captain Washington?" she said, recognition dawning. "You flew with us to Denver last month, right?" "That's correct," Marcus replied evenly. Denise barely glanced at the ID before nodding. "His ID is fine, Amber. I've flown with Captain Washington several times." Amber's lips thinned, but she wasn't ready to back down. "Protocol says we need to be absolutely certain. We can't be too careful about flight deck security." Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down the shifting eyes of crew members, the way the tension in the air had thickened. He measured his words before speaking. "Miss Whitfield, that ID has gotten me into the cockpit of every flight I've piloted for this airline for the past 10 years. If you have specific concerns, I suggest you call flight operations directly." Before Amber could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and something in her expression changed. Without another word, she turned and walked briskly down the jet bridge. "What was that about?" James murmured. Marcus exhaled slowly. "Nothing new." Meanwhile, at the terminal gate, Richard Whitfield had just arrived. At 62, he was a man who commanded attention not through height or volume, but through presence. His silver hair was neatly combed, his tailored suit spoke of precision, and the way people instinctively stepped aside as he moved through the airport suggested a lifetime spent at the top. He hadn't planned to be on this flight. A last-minute meeting in San Francisco had changed that. As he approached the gate, he spotted his daughter in animated conversation with someone on the phone. Her posture was defensive, her expression unsettled. "Amber," he called. "Everything all right with the flight?" Amber spun, eyes widening. "Dad? What are you doing here?" "Last-minute meeting," Richard replied, his gaze flickering past her to where Marcus and James stood waiting. "What's the holdup?" Amber lowered her voice. "Just a security concern with one of the pilots. His ID seems irregular." Richard's brow furrowed. "Irregular? How?" Amber hesitated. "The hologram, the photo. Something just seems off." Richard studied her for a long moment, then stepped past her, approaching Marcus. "Captain Washington, isn't it?" Marcus straightened slightly. "Mr. Whitfield, I remember reading about you in our company newsletter," Richard said, his voice steady. "That emergency landing in Denver last year. Excellent work." "Thank you, sir." Richard held out his hand. "May I see your ID?" Marcus handed it over without hesitation. Richard examined it briefly, then looked up. "Looks perfectly fine to me." His voice carried just enough authority that any lingering doubt dissipated. He handed the ID back directly to Marcus, then turned to his daughter. "Amber, a word. Now." As Richard guided his daughter aside, Marcus and James stepped onto the aircraft, the weight of the morning settling over them. The incident wasn't over. It never really was. But at least for now, they could do their jobs. The moment the wheels left the ground, Marcus Washington felt it, the shift, the weightlessness, the quiet assurance that, for the next 5 hours, the sky was his alone to command. There was something sacred about this moment, the way the earth fell away beneath him, the way the horizon stretched into infinity, limitless and untouched by the burdens that often pressed down on him at ground level. Up here, there were no gate agents narrowing their eyes at his ID, no passengers doing a double take when they heard his voice over the intercom. Up here, the only thing that mattered was skill, precision, and the unshakable responsibility of carrying hundreds of lives safely across the country. Beside him, First Officer James Chun adjusted the throttle settings, his movements as fluid as if they were a continuation of the aircraft itself. "Climbing through 10,000 feet, James announced, his voice steady. Marcus nodded. "Landing lights off. Bring her up to cruise altitude." The cockpit was a world of quiet focus, of practiced routine and calculated decisions. But even here, where everything followed procedure, where their movements were synchronized like musicians in an orchestra, Marcus felt the weight of what had happened back at the gate. The way Amber Whitfield had questioned him. The way she had looked at him. The way, even after her own father had intervened, she had avoided eye contact as she boarded. It was a familiar script played out in airports, in conference rooms, in country clubs where men who looked like him had once been told they could shine shoes but not step inside. And yet, here he was, flying this aircraft, commanding this flight, carrying the responsibility that had been doubted but never truly taken from him. The intercom light blinked. Denise Rodriguez, the lead flight attendant, was on the line. "Captain, just a heads up, looks like we have a nervous flyer in 14B. Young mother traveling with her son. First time in the air for both of them." Marcus smiled faintly. "I'll make an announcement in a bit. See if that helps." Denise hesitated. "And one more thing. Amber, she's keeping her distance. More than usual." Marcus exhaled slowly, glancing over at James, who simply gave a knowing shrug. "Not our problem," James murmured, eyes fixed on the flight display. "No," Marcus agreed, "but it could be hers." As the aircraft settled at cruising altitude, Marcus reached for the intercom, pressing the button that connected him to the hundreds of passengers sitting behind them, strapped into their seats, their lives quite literally in his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 36,000 feet, and we're expecting a smooth ride across the country today. If this is your first time flying, or if you're feeling a little uneasy, just know that you're in good hands. This plane was built to handle anything, and so were we. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." In row 14, the young mother's shoulders relaxed slightly. Across the cabin, other passengers who had barely noticed their pilot's voice before now nodded, reassured by the quiet confidence in his tone. Richard Whitfield, seated comfortably in first class, observed it all. The way Marcus spoke, the way his voice commanded without demanding. It was leadership in its purest form, not the kind that came from a title, but the kind that came from experience, from proving yourself again and again in a world that often refused to acknowledge your place in it. And then there was Amber, moving through the aisle, performing the motions of her job with precision but without warmth. Richard watched her, watched the way she responded to passengers who looked like her with an easy, natural engagement, and the way she responded to others with efficiency, but not effort. He wondered how many flights she had worked like this, how many moments of unconscious bias had passed unnoticed, unchallenged. And then he wondered, with a sinking weight in his chest, how many of those moments he himself had overlooked over the years. The drink service began. Denise handled first class with the grace of someone who had done this for 2 decades, engaging passengers in small talk, anticipating their needs before they voiced them. Amber moved through the cabin like a machine, asking the same perfunctory question over and over, "Something to drink?" but reserving her smiles for a select few. It was subtle. It always was. And then it wasn't. In seat 3C, Dr. Maya Reynolds, one of the top cardiologists in the country, requested a blanket. Amber nodded but continued down the aisle, serving 3 more passengers before returning with it. Dr. Reynolds accepted it with a quiet thank you, but Richard, watching from a few rows away, noted the slight pursing of her lips, the way her hands lingered on her notepad just long enough to jot something down. A few rows back, Professor Ella Chen, grading a stack of sociology papers, had observed the interaction as well. Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment. He had spent decades building Skyline Airways into an industry leader, ensuring that service was impeccable, that passengers felt valued, that every flight was an experience worth remembering. And yet, here was his own daughter, undercutting that mission without even realizing it. The moment the drink service concluded, he pressed the call button. Amber approached, her professional mask firmly in place. "What can I get you, Dad?" Richard looked up at her, his gaze unreadable. "A moment of your time, when you're finished here." Amber hesitated but nodded. "Of course." Across the cabin, Marcus remained focused on the flight ahead, hands steady on the controls. He didn't need to see what was happening behind him to know that the real turbulence of this flight wasn't in the air. It was in the people, in the choices they made, in the small moments that either reinforced the way things had always been or carved a path toward something better. And in the end, it wasn't about policies or mission statements. It wasn't about statistics or PR campaigns. It was about people one by one deciding whether to see what was right in front of them or to turn away. Richard Whitfield had spent a lifetime flying above the clouds. But for the first time in a long time, he realized he had been blind to something happening right beneath his feet. The sky stretched endless and unbroken beyond the cockpit windows, a deep, unblemished blue that wrapped around the aircraft like a quiet promise. 36,000 feet above the world, Marcus Washington felt a rare moment of stillness. Up here, above the noise, the judgments, the invisible walls people built around one another, there was only the steady hum of the engines and the delicate balance of airspeed, altitude, and direction. He had spent his life chasing the clean, mathematical precision of flight, where skill ruled over bias, where the laws of physics cared nothing for the color of his skin. But the ground had a way of reaching up, even when you thought you had left it behind. James Chun adjusted a dial, his fingers moving with the ease of habit, his gaze flicking across the instrument panel before glancing toward Marcus. Still thinking about it? Marcus didn't need to ask what it was. He had spent years pretending moments like these didn't stay with him. But they did. They always did. Thinking about what? He replied, a trace of wry humor in his voice. James smirked but didn't push. Just making sure you're flying the plane and not letting it fly you. Marcus let out a small chuckle, but his grip on the control column remained firm. Don't worry, I've got it. The radio crackled, and a voice from air traffic control filled the cockpit. Skyline 1372. Adjust heading 2 degrees north to avoid turbulence. James confirmed the change, and Marcus made the adjustment with the kind of steady precision that had become second nature. A few degrees here, a slight power adjustment, their small corrections, imperceptible to the passengers, but enough to ensure a smooth ride. He had learned early in his career that most turbulence in the air could be avoided with just a few adjustments. On the ground, though, that was another story. Back in the cabin, Richard Whitfield leaned forward in his first-class seat, watching his daughter as she moved through the aisle. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people. It was what had made him a sharp businessman, what had allowed him to build an airline from the ground up, negotiating contracts, navigating boardrooms, earning the respect of an industry where only the ruthless survived. And yet, he had somehow failed to read his own daughter. He had been watching all flight, the way she interacted with passengers, the way she smiled easily at some but barely met the eyes of others. It wasn't overt. It never was. That was the problem. Bias rarely announced itself. It whispered. It showed itself in delays that shouldn't have happened, in extra scrutiny given without justification, in small, dismissive gestures that left a lasting impact. Amber moved past row 5, her expression neutral. Her voice clipped as she asked, "Chicken or pasta?" Professor Ellichin, still grading papers, looked up. "Could you tell me what the chicken dish is?" Amber didn't sigh, but her tone carried the weight of impatience. "It's chicken, in a white sauce." "That's helpful," Professor Chin murmured, though the slight arch of her brow suggested otherwise. "I'll take the pasta." Richard saw it the way Amber had explained the meal options in far more detail just moments ago to the white businessman in 4A. He wondered if she even realized it. Probably not. That was how these things worked. People weren't always aware of their own biases. But it wasn't about intention. It was about impact. He pressed the call button. Amber appeared at his side, her professional smile firmly in place. "What can I get you, Dad?" Richard didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch, watching the flicker of uncertainty in her expression. "Sit," he said finally, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. Amber hesitated. "I'm working." "This is part of your work," he replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, she sat. "Tell me what you see," Richard said, his voice quieter now. Amber frowned. "What do you mean?" Richard gestured subtly toward the passengers around them. "Look, really look. Who are they? How do they experience this flight?" Amber's gaze flicked across the cabin. Passengers, she said cautiously. A businessman in 1B, a doctor in 3C, I think, a professor in 5B. Richard studied her. And how do you interact with them? Amber stiffened. The same as anyone else. Richard's expression didn't change. Are you sure? A muscle in Amber's jaw tightened. What are you saying? I'm saying, Richard said, keeping his voice even, that I've been watching you, and I've seen a pattern. Amber folded her arms. Oh? And what pattern is that? Richard leaned forward slightly. You give certain passengers more attention. You answer their questions more fully. You smile more easily. And with others, you keep your distance. You cut conversations short. You do your job efficiently, but not warmly. Amber's face reddened. That's not fair. I treat everyone the same. Richard shook his head. No, you think you do, but perception isn't reality. And right now, reality is that some passengers are getting the best version of you, and others are getting the bare minimum. Amber's hands clenched in her lap. Are you calling me racist? Richard's voice didn't rise, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath it. I'm asking you to examine your actions, and if that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe it should. For a long moment, Amber said nothing. The steady hum of the aircraft filled the silence between them. Finally, she swallowed hard. I didn't think I was that kind of person. Few people do, Richard said simply. The question is, what do you do now that you're aware of it? Amber's gaze dropped to her hands. Her fingers twisted together, restless. She had spent her life proving herself. Proving she deserved her position. Proving she wasn't just the CEO's daughter. Proving she had worked just as hard as anyone else. But what if, in all that proving, she had failed to see the ways she had fallen short? Somewhere behind her, a passenger pressed the call button. Amber exhaled slowly and stood. I have to get back to work. Richard nodded but said nothing as she walked away. Up in the cockpit, Marcus adjusted their heading slightly, his hands steady on the controls. He knew nothing of the conversation happening behind him, but he had learned long ago that change didn't come from grand gestures. It came from small moments, a shift in awareness, a willingness to look at the world and at oneself more honestly. The aircraft continued slicing through the sky, steady, unshaken, but on the ground, somewhere far below, something small had begun to shift. The first jolt of turbulence rippled through the aircraft like an invisible hand nudging its frame, subtle but unmistakable. Marcus Washington barely reacted. He had spent too many years in the sky to be fazed by the restless movement of air masses colliding thousands of feet below. He simply adjusted his grip on the yoke, his mind calculating the data streaming through the flight display, wind speed, pressure differentials, altitude adjustments, all of it as instinctual to him as breathing. James Chun, his first officer, glanced at him and smirked. I know that look. Marcus arched a brow. What look? The one that says, I've flown through worse, and I'm not impressed. Marcus chuckled, but his eyes stayed on the instrument panel. I have flown through worse, and I am not impressed. The radio crackled. Skyline 1372. Expect moderate turbulence for the next 15 minutes. Advise cabin crew to secure service. James acknowledged the message while Marcus made the necessary adjustments, leveling the aircraft at a slightly different altitude to minimize the disturbance. He reached for the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a bit of turbulence, but nothing out of the ordinary. Please keep your seatbelts fastened, and we'll have you back to smooth air soon. Down in the cabin, passengers tightened their grips on armrests, eyes darting toward the windows as the aircraft gave another shudder. The young mother in 14B clutched her son's hand, whispering reassurances that were more for herself than for him. Denise Rodriguez, ever the professional, moved through first class, checking seatbelts and offering calm smiles to those who needed them. And Amber Whitfield, who had been moving mechanically through her duties since her father's conversation, found herself frozen for a second as another ripple of turbulence jolted her balance. She had worked flights through storms before. She had seen drinks spill, passengers clutch armrests in white-knuckled fear, heard the nervous whispers that always followed the unexpected movements of a plane caught in unstable air. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the weight of her father's words. Maybe it was the way she had caught herself hesitating before answering a passenger's request, suddenly aware of what had previously been automatic. Maybe it was the quiet realization that she had spent years convincing herself she saw the world clearly only to be forced to admit she had been looking through a fogged window all along. She steadied herself against the galley counter, inhaled deeply, and looked out into the cabin. The businessman in 8D was scrolling through his phone, pretending not to be concerned. The elderly woman in 22A was murmuring a quiet prayer. And in 3C, Dr. Maya Reynolds sat still, her expression unreadable, but her eyes watchful. Amber moved toward the aisle and approached a middle-aged black man in seat 10A. He had been polite earlier, but she had brushed off his question about connection times with a quick, dismissive answer, too preoccupied with her own thoughts to engage. Now, she saw the way he gripped the armrest, how his eyes flicked toward her with unspoken expectation. "Sir," she said, her voice quieter than usual, "would you like me to bring you some water? Or anything else to make you more comfortable?" The man looked surprised for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Water would be nice. Thank you." Amber nodded and made her way to the galley. A simple act, a minor correction, but one that hours ago she might not have even considered. Back in first class, Richard Whitfield was still watching. He had spent his career fine-tuning the smallest details of the airline, the weight of the leather seats, the precise shade of blue in the cabin lighting, the efficiency of boarding protocols. But now, he was realizing that the most important details were not in the design of the aircraft or the balance sheets. They were in the people. They were in the choices made moment by moment, in the way someone like Amber hesitated before deciding to extend an extra kindness. The turbulence eased, and a quiet exhale rippled through the cabin. Passengers settled. Conversations resumed, and somewhere near the front, Denise pressed the call button to the cockpit. "Captain," she said when Marcus picked up, "just letting you know things are settling down back here, and something interesting is happening with Amber." Marcus glanced at James, who raised an eyebrow. "Interesting how?" "She's paying attention," Denise said simply. "Really paying attention." Marcus was silent for a beat. Then he nodded. "Noted." The aircraft continued cutting through the sky, smooth and steady now. Outside, the vast stretch of America unfolded beneath them, cities and rivers and highways, lives intersecting in a million unseen ways. In the cockpit, Marcus and James prepared for their next set of adjustments. In the cabin, Richard watched his daughter with something between scrutiny and hope. And Amber, for the first time in a long time, was beginning to truly see the people around her. Sometimes turbulence wasn't just in the air. Sometimes it was the internal kind, the kind that shook you in ways you hadn't anticipated. But the thing about turbulence was this: it didn't last forever. And what mattered most wasn't avoiding it. It was how you adjusted your course when it hit. The hum of the engines filled the cockpit with its steady, familiar rhythm, a sound that had long since become a comfort to Marcus Washington. It was a reminder that, no matter what unfolded behind the reinforced door, up here the rules were clear. Airspeed, altitude, direction, each movement calculated, each variable accounted for. There was no second-guessing gravity, no debating the laws of aerodynamics. The sky did not care about perceptions or prejudice. It only cared that you knew what you were doing. And Marcus knew. He always had. James Chun adjusted the course slightly, his fingers gliding over the controls with the kind of practiced ease that came from repetition and experience. "How's the cabin?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already had a feeling. Marcus didn't look away from the flight display. Denise said Amber is learning. James let out a low whistle. "That's one way to put it." Marcus exhaled through his nose. "You ever notice how some people go their whole lives without questioning the way they move through the world?" James smirked. "You mean, have I ever noticed how some people don't realize the rules aren't the same for everyone?" Marcus gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, that." James considered this, then shrugged. Maybe today's her first real lesson. Behind them, in the cabin, Richard Whitfield sat with his fingers steepled, watching his daughter like a man studying the weather, searching for signs of a storm or, perhaps, a break in the clouds. He had never been the type of father who lectured. He had always preferred to teach by example, to build an empire and let the results speak for themselves. He had told himself that was enough, that if he set a standard of excellence, his daughter would absorb the deeper lessons along the way. Now he wasn't so sure. Amber moved through the aisle with careful intention, the stiffness that had once defined her posture beginning to fade. She was listening more now, not just to passengers' words but to their unspoken needs. She knelt briefly to speak with the young mother in 14B, offering reassurance rather than just a transaction. She returned with a fresh cup of tea for Dr. Reynolds in 3C before it was requested, a quiet acknowledgement of the earlier moment she had mishandled. And when she passed by Professor Chun in 5B, their eyes met for the briefest second, an unspoken recognition passing between them. Richard pressed the call button. Amber approached with a careful expression. "Yes, sir." Richard gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Sit." She hesitated but complied, her hands folding neatly in her lap, her body rigid with the kind of tension that came from knowing a conversation was about to shift the ground beneath you. Richard's voice was quieter now, measured. "Tell me what's changed." Amber frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Richard's gaze didn't waver. "Since our talk earlier. You're different." "Why?" Amber exhaled slowly, her fingers twisting together. "Because I started seeing things I hadn't seen before." Richard nodded, waiting. Amber's voice was softer now, less defensive. "I've been so focused on proving I belong in this job, on making sure people take me seriously, that I never thought about how I take them in. I never asked myself whether I was truly seeing people or just deciding who mattered based on what felt familiar." Richard studied her for a long moment. "And what are you going to do about it?" Amber swallowed. "Keep learning. Keep paying attention." Richard's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "That's not enough." Amber blinked. "What?" Richard leaned forward. "Awareness is the first step, but it's not the finish line. You don't get credit for just realizing you've been part of the problem. You only get credit for what you do next." Amber sat back, absorbing this. Richard's voice stayed even, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. "I built this airline with a vision, not just for luxury or efficiency, but for equality. I wanted a company where people felt valued, where service meant something. And today, I saw my own daughter undermine that without even realizing it." He paused, his words sinking in before he continued. "I take responsibility for that. I should have taught you better. But now that you do see it, what happens next is up to you." Amber looked down at her hands, her throat tight with something she didn't quite have a name for. For so long, she had thought of herself as competent, as capable, as someone who had worked hard, who had earned her place. She had never thought of herself as someone who made things harder for others. But wasn't that the problem? The way people assumed they were fair, simply because they had never been forced to confront the consequences of their blind spots. She lifted her chin, meeting her father's gaze. "I won't forget this." Richard nodded. "Good. Now show me." Amber stood, smoothing the front of her uniform, and stepped back into the aisle with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. In the cockpit, Marcus checked their approach into San Francisco, his hands steady, his focus unbroken. James glanced at him. "Think anything will change?" Marcus gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We'll see." The aircraft hummed forward, cutting through the sky, steady as ever. But below them, somewhere deep in the currents of human understanding, something had begun to shift. The descent into San Francisco began with the slightest tilt of the nose, a gentle transition from the endless blue into the layered hues of the earth below. The city stretched toward the horizon, a mosaic of movement and history, of bridges built to connect and roads drawn to divide. Marcus Washington had flown this approach more times than he could count. But today, the act of bringing 300 passengers safely back to solid ground felt heavier than usual. Some flights were just flights. Others carried something else, a shift, a reckoning, the beginning of an understanding that had taken far too long to arrive. James Chun adjusted the navigation settings, his voice steady over the radio as he confirmed their clearance. Looks like we're being routed a little north. Adds about 10 minutes. Marcus nodded, his hands steady on the controls. Let's keep the ride smooth. Last thing we need is another round of unnecessary turbulence. James smirked. You mean in the air, right? Marcus gave him a sidelong glance but said nothing. Some turbulence didn't come from weather patterns or wind currents. Some turbulence walked on 2 feet, made assumptions before facts, and left behind a wake of discomfort that no seatbelt sign could prepare you for. And yet, change didn't happen at 36,000 feet. It happened in the quiet moments after a mistake was acknowledged, in the choices made when no one was watching. Back in the cabin, Amber Whitfield moved with quiet precision, but something in her demeanor had softened. She was seeing people now, really seeing them, not just as names on a manifest or figures to be managed, but as individuals with expectations, fears, and unspoken needs. The shift wasn't in what she was doing, it was in how she was doing it. The businessman in 8D, the one she had barely acknowledged earlier, was met with a nod of understanding when she handed him a fresh cup of coffee. The young mother in 14B received an extra moment of reassurance, a warmth in Amber's tone that hadn't been there before. The difference was small but unmistakable, the kind of thing that could not be faked, only learned. In seat 3C, Dr. Maya Reynolds watched with the quiet observation of someone who had spent a lifetime recognizing these moments, the slow, uncertain steps of someone beginning to understand the weight of their actions. She had seen it in medical interns realizing that knowledge wasn't the same as empathy, in colleagues who had only just begun to recognize the privileges they had mistaken for merit. Change was a slow, uneven process, but it had to start somewhere. Amber approached her with an unexpected hesitation, her fingers smoothing over the fabric of her uniform as if she needed something tangible to hold on to. "Dr. Reynolds," she said quietly, "I wanted to apologize for earlier, for how I handled your request. It wasn't professional and it wasn't right." Dr. Reynolds studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you for acknowledging that," she said simply. "I hope it's the beginning of a change, not just a moment of regret." Amber straightened slightly. "I'm working on that." Dr. Reynolds gave a small, knowing smile. "Good." A few rows back, Richard Whitfield observed the exchange. His hands folded in his lap, his face unreadable. He had spent decades shaping the identity of his airline, ensuring that Skyline Airways was synonymous with excellence. And yet, sitting here now, watching his daughter take the first real steps toward understanding, he realized that he had been focused on the wrong measures of success. It wasn't enough to build an airline that moved people efficiently from one place to another. It had to be an airline that saw them for who they were. As the city grew larger beneath them, Marcus pressed the intercom button. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into San Francisco. We'll be landing in approximately 25 minutes. Weather ahead is clear, and we expect a smooth arrival. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened as we prepare for landing." The calm authority in his voice settled over the cabin, a quiet reminder of the hands guiding them down. Richard closed his eyes briefly, thinking of how many times Marcus had made that announcement, how many times passengers had heard his voice and formed silent, invisible judgments about the man sitting in the captain's seat, and how many times Marcus had been forced to prove them wrong without ever saying a word. The runway came into view, long and steady, the kind of landing that required skill, patience, and an unwavering hand. Marcus adjusted for the crosswinds, his movements precise, practiced, the weight of the aircraft responding to his every command. 500 feet, James called. Marcus made a final adjustment. 200. The runway rushed up to meet them. 100. 50. 30. 20. 10. The landing gear met the ground in a smooth, confident touchdown, the kind of landing passengers barely noticed but professionals respected. James let out a low exhale. "Textbook, Captain." Marcus gave a small nod. "Let's get them home." As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the final routines of flight took over. Passengers reached for their belongings, stretching after hours in their seats, their minds already shifting toward their next destination. But for some, the journey had been something more than just miles traveled. In the cockpit, Marcus and James ran through their post-flight checklist, their hands moving over switches and levers in a final ritual of closure. In the cabin, Richard stood slowly, adjusting his cuffs before making his way toward the front. He stopped just outside the cockpit door, looking in at the man who had carried them across the country with the kind of skill that left no room for doubt. "Captain Washington," he said. Marcus looked up. "Mr. Whitfield." Richard hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then he extended his hand. "Excellent flight." Marcus met his gaze, his expression unreadable, before reaching out and shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir." Richard nodded. "I'd like to speak with you further, if you have time before your return flight." Marcus arched a brow. "About what?" Richard's voice was quieter now. "About how we can do better." For a moment, Marcus considered him, as if weighing the weight of the words against the history behind them. Then finally he nodded. "I have about 2 hours." Richard exhaled slightly. "That's enough time to start." Behind them, passengers began to disembark, stepping into the golden light of a San Francisco afternoon. Amber assisted an elderly woman with her carry-on, her touch careful, her voice softer than it had been at the start of the flight. Dr. Reynolds walked past, offering the briefest nod of approval. Professor Chun made another note in her journal, her expression thoughtful. And somewhere deep in the quiet spaces of her mind, Amber knew this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Outside, the airport pulsed with movement, arrivals, departures, the endless rhythm of people chasing destinations. But for those who had been on Flight 1372, something had changed. Perhaps only slightly, perhaps only in ways too small to see. But change had begun, and like any journey, it only needed a place to start. The return flight to New York was set against a sky beginning to dim, streaks of gold melting into deep blues as the last light of day surrendered to the inevitable hush of night. Inside the cockpit of Flight 1373, Marcus Washington ran his fingers over the overhead switches, his mind as steady as his hands, his focus locked on the task ahead. Takeoffs and landings demanded precision, but it was the hours in between the quiet stretches of cruising altitude that tested a pilot's discipline. His ability to remain present, to anticipate, to adjust before adjustment became necessary. Life had a way of working the same way. The turbulence rarely announced itself in advance. The small moments, the unnoticed shifts, were often what mattered most. James Chin exhaled as he checked the flight plan. "Smooth air all the way back," he said, tapping the screen. "Looks like we caught a break." Marcus nodded, his eyes on the instrument panel. "Good. Let's keep it that way." Behind them, in the first-class cabin, Richard Whitfield settled into his seat, watching the world beyond the window shrink into a web of flickering city lights. He had spent decades moving through airports like these, slipping into planes with the quiet assurance of a man who had built the very thing carrying him through the sky. But today, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the efficiency of the airline, the profit margins, or the subtle luxuries that separated Skyline Airways from its competitors. He was thinking about something far more difficult to measure: the weight of his own blind spots, the spaces where his leadership had failed to reach. Amber Whitfield moved through the cabin with a presence that was still deliberate, still polished, but no longer just about control. Something had softened, just enough to make the difference felt rather than forced. She stopped at Dr. Reynolds' seat, her voice quiet but sure. "Can I get you anything else before we take off?" Dr. Reynolds studied her for a beat, her expression unreadable. "No, thank you," she said. Then, after a pause, "But I appreciate you asking." Amber gave a small nod before moving on, but something in the exchange settled differently in her chest. She wasn't looking for praise, wasn't trying to prove something in a single interaction. But she was beginning to understand that respect was not a performance. It was a practice. Further back, Professor Ella Chun made another note in the margins of the small leather-bound journal in her lap. She had been watching the quiet shifts in Amber, the subtle adjustments in body language, the way she no longer rushed past certain passengers with that unspoken urgency of avoidance. These moments were small, but they mattered. People often thought change had to be grand, that it had to be shouted, marched, legislated into existence. But more often, it was these shifts, the unseen decisions to be better, to do better, to listen rather than assume, that carved the real paths forward. The final boarding announcement played over the speakers, the familiar reminders of safety and procedure filling the cabin as passengers adjusted seatbelts and powered down devices. From the cockpit, Marcus listened, waiting for the last indicator that all was secure. Then, with the same quiet certainty that had defined his entire career, he pressed the intercom button. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're ready for departure and expect a smooth flight back to New York. Flight time is just over 5 hours, and we'll be flying at 38,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and we'll take care of the rest." The words were routine, but the tone calm, unwavering, had its own gravity. In 5B, Professor Chun noted how passengers settled slightly at the sound of it. How quickly people accepted that this voice, this presence, was in command. How strange it was, she thought, that the same certainty, the same authority that reassured hundreds of passengers at a time could still be questioned by the very system that had trained him. The aircraft rolled forward, engines humming with controlled power as they surged toward the runway. In the final moment before takeoff, Richard leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. He had spent the past few hours speaking with Marcus in the airline lounge, discussing not just the incident in LaGuardia, but the deeper currents beneath it, the hiring practices, the training gaps, the silent biases that shaped who was seen, who was trusted, who had to prove themselves twice over just to be accepted once. And as much as Richard had built Skyline Airways into one of the most respected carriers in the industry, he had to admit something that didn't sit comfortably. Respect, when unevenly applied, was not truly respect at all. The wheels lifted from the ground, the city falling away beneath them, and with it, some of the old ways of thinking that had once seemed unshakable. Hours passed in quiet efficiency. Marcus and James monitored the systems, adjusting for minor wind shifts, communicating with air traffic control. Denise moved through the cabin with her practiced grace, offering water, blankets, reassurances when needed. And Amber, for the first time in her career, was fully aware of how she moved through this space, not as someone merely doing a job, but as someone shaping an experience. In seat 4A, a black businessman pressed the call button, and Amber responded with measured calm. "What can I do for you, sir?" He glanced at his watch. "I have a tight connection in New York. Any idea if we'll be landing on time?" Amber didn't rush to answer. She didn't dismiss the question or brush him off with vague reassurances. Instead, she took a breath and said, "Let me check with the crew. I'll get you an answer as soon as I can." The man nodded, satisfied, and she stepped into the galley, tapping the intercom for an update from the flight deck. Up front, Marcus responded smoothly. "Winds are in our favor. We should be right on schedule." Amber relayed the information back, and as she turned, she caught her father watching her. There was no overt approval in his face, no grand display of acknowledgement. But the small nod he gave her as she passed meant more than words could have. Hours later, as the aircraft began its descent into New York, the sky had shifted into deep indigo, city lights flickering like scattered constellations below. Marcus guided them in with the quiet mastery of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove himself. His hands steady as the runway lights stretched toward them like a quiet welcome home. 500 feet, James called. Marcus adjusted slightly. 200. The wheels touched the ground with the kind of effortless grace that defined the best pilots, not flashy, not dramatic, just perfectly executed. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers stirred, stretching, gathering their belongings. Richard remained seated, his gaze thoughtful as he watched Amber move through the cabin, helping an elderly woman with her bag, pausing to offer a genuine smile to a nervous traveler who had been gripping his seatbelt since takeoff. When the last passenger had disembarked, Richard stepped toward the cockpit, finding Marcus still at his post, finishing his final checks. "Captain," he said. Marcus looked up. "Mr. Whitfield." Richard hesitated, then extended his hand. "This isn't just about today. I want you involved, not just in conversation, but in shaping what comes next." Marcus studied him, reading the weight behind the words. Then, after a moment, he took the offered hand. "I'll hold you to that." Richard nodded. "Good. You should." As the crew gathered their belongings, moving toward the terminal, Amber lingered near the galley, her hands resting on the counter for just a moment longer than necessary. When she finally stepped off the aircraft, her father walking just a few steps ahead, she wasn't sure if she had changed in the way he wanted. But she knew one thing for certain: she was ready to try. The cool night air wrapped around Marcus Washington as he stepped out of the terminal, the faint hum of jet engines still echoing in his bones. LaGuardia pulsed behind him, a world in constant motion, passengers spilling out into the night with their lives in tow, some weary, some eager, all moving toward something. Marcus inhaled deeply, letting the familiar scent of jet fuel and asphalt settle him, grounding him after a flight that had felt like more than just miles covered. Some flights carried more weight than others, not in fuel or cargo, but in the moments that unfolded within them. This had been one of those flights. James Chun walked beside him, stretching his arms overhead. "You ever get the feeling that some flights don't end when the wheels touch down?" Marcus glanced at him, a small smirk forming. "All the time." James let out a quiet chuckle. "Thought so." He shifted his bag onto his shoulder. "You meeting Lydia at home?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, and I'm sure she'll have a million questions." James grinned. "Better you than me. I'm getting a burger and passing out." They parted ways with a simple nod, the kind that didn't need words. Some partnerships were built in boardrooms. Others were built at 36,000 feet, in the quiet hum of trust that formed between two people who had each other's backs when it mattered. Inside the terminal, Richard Whitfield stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands in his pockets, watching as the last of the passengers from Flight 1373 disappeared into the New York night. He had spent years looking at airports like these and seeing only numbers: passenger volume, fuel costs, on-time departures. But tonight, he saw something else. He saw people. People who, for a few short hours, had shared a space, had moved through a world he had built, had trusted that the name Skyline Airways meant something more than just an airline. And for the first time in years, he questioned whether it truly did. Amber approached, a slight hesitancy in her step. "You staying here all night, or?" Richard turned, exhaling slowly. "Just thinking." She studied him, waiting. Finally, he said, "You did better." Amber let out a short, quiet laugh. "Thanks. That's high praise from you." Richard didn't smile. "It's not praise. It's an observation. Better isn't the same as good enough." Amber's expression sobered. "I know." Richard nodded slightly. "Good. Because I need you to understand something. Change isn't about one moment. It's not about one apology, one conversation, or one flight. It's about the next flight, and the one after that. It's about showing up differently every single time." Amber crossed her arms, glancing toward the windows, watching her own reflection in the glass. "And what about you? Are you going to show up differently?" Richard studied her, and for once she didn't look away. "Yes," he said finally. "I am." Outside, Marcus slid into his car, his fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel before he reached for his phone. One unread message from Lydia. "Home soon?" He smiled, typing back a simple, "On my way." As he pulled out onto the highway, the city unfolded around him, alive, moving, shifting. The lights of Manhattan shimmered in the distance, the skyline standing tall, built on stories, on ambition, on the choices people had made long before this night. Change, he had learned, was never immediate. It wasn't an announcement or a grand gesture. It was a series of moments, small and quiet, stacking upon each other until one day, the weight of them shifted something real. One flight didn't change an airline. One conversation didn't rewrite history. One realization didn't erase the past. But they mattered. They always mattered. Because change, real, lasting change, wasn't about the dramatic moments. It was about the choices made when no one was watching. The adjustments made in silence. the steady hand on the controls, guiding something massive toward a new destination. As he merged onto the freeway, Marcus let the thought settle in his chest. Today had been a long day, a hard day, a necessary day, and in a world where change often felt impossibly slow, that was something worth holding on to.